Ever pondered the sheer scale of countries across our globe? Join me on an exhilarating journey through the world's unique country shapes. Together, using the wonders of Google Earth, we'll uncover the breathtaking diversity of their landscapes, explore neighboring nations, and delve into their geographical placements. Some countries are embraced by vast oceans, while others are enclosed by sprawling landmasses and neighboring countries. The colors on the map tell their own stories. White signifies barren terrains, glaciers, mountain peaks, and deserts. Tan and beige denote areas with sparse vegetation, rocky landscapes, and sandy dunes, while green represents lush forests and vibrant vegetation. And of course, blue beautifully symbolizes the vastness of water bodies. In this captivating exploration, we'll compare and contrast 257 countries, ranking them from the largest to the smallest based on their total area in square kilometers. Remember, total area encapsulates both landmass and water bodies, including lakes, reservoirs, and rivers. It's a fascinating lens into understanding the vast array of sizes our world's nations encompass. 1. Russia. 17,098,242 square kilometers. 2. Antarctica. 14,200,000 square kilometers. 3. Canada. 9,984,670 square kilometers. 4. United States of America. 9,833,517 square kilometers. 5. China. 9,596,960 square kilometers. 6. Brazil. 8,515,770 square kilometers. 7. Australia. 7,741,220 square kilometers. 8. India. 3,287,263 square kilometers. 9. Argentina. 2,780,400 square kilometers. 10. Kazakhstan. 2,724,900 square kilometers. 11. Algeria. 2,381,740 square kilometers. 12. Democratic Republic of Congo. 2,344,858 square kilometers. 13. Greenland. 2,166,086 square kilometers. 14. Saudi Arabia. 2,149,690 square kilometers. 15. Mexico. 1,964,375 square kilometers. 16. Indonesia. 1,904,569 square kilometers. 17. Sudan. 1,861,484 square kilometers. 18. Libya. 1,759,540 square kilometers. 19. Iran. 1,648,195 square kilometers. 20. Mongolia. 1,564,116 square kilometers. 21. Peru. 1,285,216 square kilometers. 22. Chad. 1,284,000 square kilometers. 23. Niger. 1,267,000 square kilometers. 24. Angola. 1,246,700 square kilometers. 25. Mali. 1,240,192 square kilometers. 26. South Africa. 1,219,090 square kilometers. 27. Colombia. 1,138,910 square kilometers. 28. Ethiopia. 1,104,300 square kilometers. 29. Bolivia. 1,098,581 square kilometers. 30. Mauritania. 1,030,700 square kilometers. 31. Egypt. 1,001,450 square kilometers. 32. Tanzania. 947,300 square kilometers. 33. Nigeria. 923,768 square kilometers. 34. Venezuela. 912,050 square kilometers. 35. Namibia. 824,292 square kilometers. 36. Mozambique. 799,380 square kilometers. 37. Pakistan. 796,095 square kilometers. 38. Turkey. 783,562 square kilometers. 39. Chile. 756,102 square kilometers. 40. Zambia. 752,618 square kilometers. 41. Morocco. 716,550 square kilometers. 42. Burma. 676,578 square kilometers. 43. Afghanistan. 652,230 square kilometers. 44. South Sudan. 644,329 square kilometers. 45. France. 643,801 square kilometers. 46. Somalia. 637,657 square kilometers. 47. Central African Republic. 622,984 square kilometers. 48. Ukraine. 603,550 square kilometers. 49. Madagascar. 587,041 square kilometers. 50. Botswana. 581,730 square kilometers. 51. Kenya. 580,367 square kilometers. 52. Yemen. 527,968 square kilometers. 53. Thailand. 513,120 square kilometers. 54. Spain. 505,370 square kilometers. 55. Turkmenistan. 488,100 square kilometers. 56. Cameroon. 475,440 square kilometers. 57. Papua New Guinea. 462,840 square kilometers. 58. Sweden. 450,295 square kilometers. 59. Uzbekistan. 447,400 square kilometers. 60. Iraq. 438,317 square kilometers. 61. Paraguay. 406,752 square kilometers. 62. Zimbabwe. 390,757 square kilometers. 63. Japan. 377,915 square kilometers. 64. Germany. 357,022 square kilometers. 65. Republic of the Congo. 342,000 square kilometers. 66. Finland. 338,145 square kilometers. 67. Vietnam. 331,210 square kilometers. 68. Malaysia. 329,847 square kilometers. 69. Norway. 323,802 square kilometers. 70. Ivory Coast. 322,463 square kilometers. 71. Poland. 312,685 square kilometers. 72. Oman. 309,500 square kilometers. 73. Italy. 301,340 square kilometers. 74. Philippines. 300,000 square kilometers. 75. Ecuador. 283,561 square kilometers. 76. Burkina Faso. 274,200 square kilometers. 77. New Zealand. 268,838 square kilometers. 78. Gabon. 267,667 square kilometers. 79. Guinea. 245,857 square kilometers. 80. United Kingdom. 243,610 square kilometers. 81. Uganda. 241,038 square kilometers. 82. Ghana. 238,533 square kilometers. 83. Romania. 238,391 square kilometers. 84. Laos. 236,800 square kilometers. 85. Guyana. 214,969 square kilometers. 86. Belarus. 207,600 square kilometers. 87. Kyrgyzstan. 199,951 square kilometers. 88. Senegal. 196,722 square kilometers. 89. Syria. 187,437 square kilometers. 90. Cambodia. 181,035 square kilometers. 91. Uruguay. 176,215 square kilometers. 92. Suriname. 163,820 square kilometers. 93. Tunisia. 163,610 square kilometers. 94. Bangladesh. 148,460 square kilometers. 95. Nepal. 147,181 square kilometers. 96. Tajikistan. 144,100 square kilometers. 97. Greece. 131,957 square kilometers. 98. Nicaragua. 130,370 square kilometers. 99. North Korea. 120,538 square kilometers. 100. Malawi. 118,484 square kilometers. 101. Eritrea. 117,600 square kilometers. 102. Benin. 112,622 square kilometers. 103. Honduras. 112,090 square kilometers. 104. Liberia. 111,369 square kilometers. 105. Bulgaria. 110,879 square kilometers. 106. Cuba. 110,860 square kilometers. 107. Guatemala. 108,889 square kilometers. 108. Iceland. 103,000 square kilometers. 109. South Korea. 99,720 square kilometers. 110. Hungary. 93,028 square kilometers. 111. Portugal. 92,090 square kilometers. 112. Jordan. 89,342 square kilometers. 113. Azerbaijan. 86,600 square kilometers. 114. Austria. 83,871 square kilometers. 115. United Arab Emirates. 83,600 square kilometers. 116. Czechia. 78,867 square kilometers. 117. Serbia. 77,474 square kilometers. 118. Panama. 75,420 square kilometers. 119. Sierra Leone. 71,740 square kilometers. 120. Ireland. 70,273 square kilometers. 121. Georgia. 69,700 square kilometers. 122. Sri Lanka. 65,610 square kilometers. 123. Lithuania. 65,300 square kilometers. 124. Latvia. 64,589 square kilometers. 125. Svalbard. 62,045 square kilometers. 126. Togo. 56,785 square kilometers. 127. Croatia. 56,594 square kilometers. 128. Bosnia and Herzegovina. 51,197 square kilometers. 129. Costa Rica. 51,100 square kilometers. 130. Slovakia. 49,035 square kilometers. 131. Dominican Republic. 48,670 square kilometers. 132. Estonia. 45,228 square kilometers. 133. Denmark. 43,094 square kilometers. 134. Netherlands. 41,543 square kilometers. 135. Switzerland. 41,543 square kilometers. 136. Bhutan. 38,394 square kilometers. 137. Guinea-Bissau. 36,125 square kilometers. 138. Taiwan. 35,980 square kilometers. 139. Moldova. 33,851 square kilometers. 140. Belgium. 30,528 square kilometers. 141. Lesotho. 30,355 square kilometers. 142. Armenia. 29,743 square kilometers. 143. Solomon Islands. 28,896 square kilometers. 144. Albania. 28,748 square kilometers. 145. Equatorial Guinea. 28,051 square kilometers. 146. Burundi. 27,830 square kilometers. 147. Haiti. 27,750 square kilometers. 148. Rwanda. 26,338 square kilometers. 149. North Macedonia. 25,713 square kilometers. 150. Djibouti. 23,200 square kilometers. 151. Belize. 22,966 square kilometers. 152. Israel. 21,937 square kilometers. 153. El Salvador. 21,041 square kilometers. 154. Slovenia. 20,273 square kilometers. 155. New Caledonia. 18,575 square kilometers. 156. Fiji. 18,274 square kilometers. 157. Kuwait. 17,818 square kilometers. 158. Eswatini. 17,364 square kilometers. 159. Timor-Leste. 14,874 square kilometers. 160. The Bahamas. 13,880 square kilometers. 161. Montenegro. 13,812 square kilometers. 162. Vanuatu. 12,189 square kilometers. 163. Falkland Islands. 12,173 square kilometers. 164. Qatar. 11,586 square kilometers. 165. The Gambia. 11,300 square kilometers. 166. Jamaica. 10,991 square kilometers. 167. Kosovo. 10,887 square kilometers. 168. Lebanon. 10,400 square kilometers. 169. Cyprus. 9,251 square kilometers. 170. Puerto Rico. 9,104 square kilometers. 171. West Bank. 5,860 square kilometers. 172. Brunei. 5,765 square kilometers. 173. Trinidad and Tobago. 5,128 square kilometers. 174. French Polynesia. 4,167 square kilometers. 175. Cabo Verde. 4,033 square kilometers. 176. South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands. 3,903 square kilometers. 177. Samoa. 2,831 square kilometers. 178. Luxembourg. 2,586 square kilometers. 179. Comoros. 2,235 square kilometers. 180. Mauritius. 2,040 square kilometers. 181. Virgin Islands. 1,910 square kilometers. 182. Faroe Islands. 1,393 square kilometers. 183. Hong Kong. 1,108 square kilometers. 184. São Tomé and Príncipe. 964 square kilometers. 185. Turks and Caicos Islands. 948 square kilometers. 186. Kiribati. 811 square kilometers. 187. Bahrain. 760 square kilometers. 188. Dominica. 751 square kilometers. 189. Tonga. 747 square kilometers. 190. Singapore. 719 square kilometers. 191. Federated States of Micronesia. 702 square kilometers. 192. Saint Lucia. 616 square kilometers. 193. Isle of Man. 572 square kilometers. 194. Guam. 544 square kilometers. 195. Andorra. 468 square kilometers. 196. Northern Mariana Islands. 464 square kilometers. 197. Palau. 459 square kilometers. 198. Seychelles. 455 square kilometers. 199. Curacao. 444 square kilometers. 200. Antigua and Barbuda. 443 square kilometers. 201. Barbados. 430 square kilometers. 202. Heard Island and McDonald Islands. 412 square kilometers. 203. St. Helena, Ascension, and Tristan da Cunha. 394 square kilometers. 204. St. Vincent and the Grenadines. 389 square kilometers. 205. Jan Mayen. 377 square kilometers. 206. Gaza Strip. 360 square kilometers. 207. Grenada. 344 square kilometers. 208. Malta. 316 square kilometers. 209. Maldives. 298 square kilometers. 210. Cayman Islands. 264 square kilometers. 211. St. Kitts and Nevis. 261 square kilometers. 212. Niue. 260 square kilometers. 213. St. Pierre and Miquelon. 242 square kilometers. 214. Cook Islands. 236 square kilometers. 215. American Samoa. 224 square kilometers. 216. Marshall Islands. 181 square kilometers. 217. Aruba. 180 square kilometers. 218. Liechtenstein. 160 square kilometers. 219. British Virgin Islands. 151 square kilometers. 220. Wallis and Futuna. 142 square kilometers. 221. Christmas Island. 135 square kilometers. 222. Dekelia. 131 square kilometers. 223. Akrotiri. 123 square kilometers. 224. Jersey. 116 square kilometers. 225. Montserrat. 102 square kilometers. 226. Anguilla. 91 square kilometers. 227. Guernsey. 78 square kilometers. 228. San Marino. 61 square kilometers. 229. British Indian Ocean Territory. 60 square kilometers. 230. Bermuda. 54 square kilometers. 231. Saint Martin. 50 square kilometers. 232. Bouvet Island. 49 square kilometers. 233. Pitcairn Islands. 47 square kilometers. 234. Norfolk Island. 36 square kilometers. 235. Saint Martin. 34 square kilometers. 236. Macau. 28 square kilometers. 237. Tuvalu. 26 square kilometers. 238. Saint Barthélemy. 25 square kilometers. 239. Nauru. 21 square kilometers. 240. Cocos Islands. 14 square kilometers. 241. Tokelau. 12 square kilometers. 242. Palmyra Atoll. 12 square kilometers. 243. Paracel Islands. 8 square kilometers. 244. Wake Island. 7 square kilometers. 245. Gibraltar. 7 square kilometers. 246. Clipperton Island. 6 square kilometers. 247. Midway Islands. 6 square kilometers. 248. Ashmore and Cartier Islands. 5 square kilometers. 249. Navassa Island. 5 square kilometers. 250. Spratly Islands. 5 square kilometers. 251. Jarvis Island. 5 square kilometers. 252. Johnston Atoll. 3 square kilometers. 253. Coral Sea Islands. 3 square kilometers. 254. Monaco. 2 square kilometers. 255. Howland Island. 2 square kilometers. 256. Kingman Reef. 1 square kilometer. 257. Holy See or the Vatican City. 0 square kilometer.